You're listening to On Shifting Ground from World Affairs and KQED. I'm Ray Suarez. In mid-November, the United States played host to the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Leaders Meeting. More than 20,000 attendees traveled to San Francisco, including delegates from the 21-member economies and world leaders like Joe Biden and Xi Jinping, who hashed out trade issues and negotiated agreements. Many of the conversations focused on bringing millions out of poverty while simultaneously instituting climate change policies that will bring the world closer to net zero carbon emissions. Any new climate policy will impact the lives of billions of people, but many key voices, those most vulnerable to any economic disruption, weren't invited to the table, and they hadn't been for generations. Prioritizing representation and inclusion, literally gaining a seat at the table, was the inspiration for the APEC Multi-Stakeholder Forum. The first ever AMF was organized by World Affairs and the Commonwealth Club of California, and it was also held in San Francisco during the first days of Leaders Week. A gathering of Indigenous community leaders, policy experts, and climate-focused business leaders and labor groups from across the Pacific Rim. The event focused on how the world can become carbon neutral within a few decades without creating greater global inequities. Matt Murray, the State Department's senior official who oversaw the APEC meetings throughout the year, gave remarks on this first day.
This year, under our APEC 2023 theme of creating a resilient and sustainable future for all, APEC economies have worked together to build an interconnected, innovative, and inclusive Asia-Pacific region. This multi-stakeholder forum's theme, working through a just transition, is absolutely timely and critical. That is obvious, given the numerous challenges we currently face, none more so than climate change, a global challenge that affects us all, irrespective of our economies.
For many, just transition is a buzzword, or maybe buzz phrase. It can mean almost anything. But for workers directly impacted by climate change, it means giving voice to people who are often just statistics in global trade reports. Answering the question, what does just transition mean? And what should it mean? Holds particular importance for leaders working to bring renewable energy to Indigenous communities. Leaders like Sherry Smith. She's a descendant of the Micmac tribe and president and chief executive officer of the Alliance for Tribal Clean Energy. She left a career in the private sector and dedicated her time to building energy efficiency and sustainability on tribal land. Sherry Smith, welcome to On Shifting Ground.
Thank you, Ray. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
What a story. I mean, control of the land, how it's used, and crucially, over our long history, what's under that land has been a critical part of the long saga of Indigenous people and the centuries of encounter in North America. Why did you found this organization?
Oh, that's a good question. I founded the organization in 2016 after meeting a tribe in the plains, the Great Plains of our country. And I'm of Indigenous descent. I descend through both of my parents from the Mi'kmaq Nation of so-called Maine and the Canadian Maritimes. But I did not grow up on a reservation. And tribes on the East Coast and California as well, we were assimilated really a long, long time ago. So we don't have the experience that our Plains State tribes, our Midwest tribes, Southwest tribes have. We live in typical cities and towns for the most part. So after being in the clean energy space for the better part of 3 decades, when I first encountered what I call energy poverty, I was devastated, astounded, shocked, all of those adjectives, to see that in the 21st century in America, that there were Native people living in abject poverty without access to electricity sometimes, and that's one form of energy poverty. But the one that struck me the most was the high costs of energy for Native people, simply because they're Native people. And the culprit is oftentimes small cooperative utilities served by big suppliers. And the rates that Native people are charged versus non-Native are sometimes double or more for the same electrons down the same line. And when I saw how that contributed to this dilemma of heat or eat on reservations, I knew in that moment that my whole career in energy and in education, living at that nexus, that I had to do something. So that's how I came to the work.
Isn't there an intense paradox embedded in the heart of this? Native people have significant presence in places that supply energy, whether it's hydroelectric in the Great Lakes, natural gas in Utah, uranium and oil in the Southwest. But those resources haven't made Native people rich or, as you just told us, even secure. What has to change?
Well, it's a good point, Ray. Many tribes, despite the promise of riches under their feet, have not succumbed to that pressure. And these tribes have upheld their sacred covenants to protect and preserve the earth. And so in exchange for that, they suffer from poverty. Those that have allowed the extraction on their lands have benefited, but it's usually the outsiders, the settlers, Western corporations that are having most of the benefit. And clean energy represents an opportunity to move away from those extractive economies and extraction period and towards clean and regenerative practices, which are very much in line with Native ethos. And that's what has to change when we're talking about energy development, clean energy development, and all the opportunity that exists right now because of the IRA and related legislation. We have to make sure that we don't repeat what happened in our last build out of the electric grid in our country, for example, where it was built squarely on the backs of Native Americans. We need to make sure that tribes are not only having a seat at the table, but they're building the table and inviting everyone else to it. That's what has to happen.
In recent decades, there have been repeated legal battles over sovereign rights, mineral rights, drilling rights, and even some recent landmark cases about control of the land and title. Have those court cases resulted in any new possibilities for Native people?
I will say that the trust responsibility that the United States has to tribes has not been upheld in general. And in this era, we're seeing some positive signs, and in this administration especially. And we're getting to the heart of that matter. This organization in our Tribal Energy Equity Summit, for example, convened FERC and other federal agencies together with tribal leaders to discuss those hard questions.
Remind people what FERC is.
Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. They're who control all energy rates and grid infrastructure in our country. And they have been asleep at the wheel in previous years. And as I opened the summit with this, I said to everyone, none of us here are responsible for what happened to this point, but we are certainly responsible for making sure that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past. And we have to start now and work together.
Recently, I've been on Crow tribal land in Montana, on the land of several different bands in New Mexico. And one thing they have in common, a lot of sunshine and not a lot of solar collectors. Is that one road that's so far not being fully taken toward energy independence?
Well, you've got to look at the history. For example, the Crow have a fossil development history and went that route because they did not want their people to suffer from poverty. And they have had challenges with fossil development in their communities. There's addiction and missing and murdered Indigenous women and people and all the things that come with outside developers being on your land. And the extractive industries have harmed the tribe in many ways, even while paying the bills. So some tribes are not opposed. We don't see a lot of opposition to solar or to other renewables in themselves. It's just they don't want to have to give up a reliable source of revenue. So we have to do everything all at once. And solar represents a tremendous opportunity. It is the low-hanging fruit. We work with tribes on all kinds of renewables, but solar represents the cheapest form of new energy generation in our country right now in the world. And with tribes controlling 2% of all land in our country, 5% of that is ripe for renewables development. And it makes Indian country a very valuable place to do business and to develop solar. So our job is to protect the tribe's best interest and to vet those developers with direct pay and elective pay and the wonderful tax incentives that are now available as well. We are standing shoulder to shoulder with tribes, and our subject matter experts are helping to ensure that their best interests are protected throughout the process.
Earlier on, you mentioned that there's been broken promises and exploitation and failing to live up to their side of the covenant from energy production industries. Is there, at long last, enough accumulated expertise on how to shape these agreements, how to shape these covenants, so that tribal organizations don't get fleeced, don't get exploited, don't end up falling way short of what they're promised on the front end?
That expertise, that wisdom has always existed, Ray. It's just a matter of whether or not the federal construct wants to acknowledge it and do what's right. As I said, this administration is, in my lifetime, it's the first time we're seeing a genuine dedication to righting the wrongs of the past. And when you think about the history from the deliberate extermination of the buffalo by colonists, westward expansion, manifest destiny, all of those things put not only Native people, all of us, every walk of life, every human that lives in this country is a victim of colonization. The earth used to provide for all of our needs: food, clothing, shelter, medicine, our economy. When colonization came and the lands were pillaged and the people were massacred, we removed human beings' ability to be self-sustaining. So that legacy is going to take my lifetime and my children's lifetime before I think we see a true reconciliation. But we're on the right track. I have hope.
Well, if we're going to rebuild, let's say, a right relationship between governments and the tribes, between tribes and the land, between Americans in general and the land, what does that look like? How does it differ from the regime that's in place right now? How would a vision of energy production and consumption that was designed around Alliance for Tribal Clean Energy priorities look different from what we're doing now?
Well, first, it takes an acknowledgement of how we got here, and then a willingness to, there's a word in my ancestral language, the Mi'kmaq, when they were colonized very early. One of the hereditary chiefs I descend from on my mom's side was baptized Catholic in 1605. So you think about, they were being colonized then, and they coined a term, Edeweptmumk, and I won't ask you to pronounce it, but Edeweptmumk, literally translated to English, means two-eyed seeing. And it means seeing the benefits of indigenous wisdom and knowledge and ways of being, and also appreciating and using responsibly the wisdom and technology of Western ways. We have to get to that point where both are considered equal by all. And we have to, in our government, meet tribes where they're at. The tribal leaders that came to the Equity Summit, they sat together in a room for a day and they wrote a statement that basically said, we demand to be met where we're at in energy development. And we demand that you come to us first for consultation. You don't make decisions and come later and tell us about them. Don't seek forgiveness instead of permission. And they don't even seek forgiveness throughout history, right? So what it looks like from here is having Native people in those conversations from the get-go, not as an afterthought later, not as a checkbox on a federal application. Native people, marginalized communities all across the country, not just Native communities, need to be a part of the planning and the discussions from the very start.
Does recognition of tribal sovereignty almost force a seat at the table, where in other eras one might not have been assumed or given.
You would think, based on the term sovereignty, that it would, but it hasn't. And tribes being sovereign nations, but beholden to the federal government if they want federal recognition, which comes with certain benefits that many tribes that don't have economies of their own need to survive. And so that in itself is problematic. And when you're talking about clean energy development, we are supporting tribes right now who have wonderful, viable projects that could be life-changing for their people. They could actually set them on a path towards energy sovereignty, but the systemic inequities in the interconnection system and in just the grant application system in itself present hurdles. So it's one thing to pump billions of dollars into Indian country. It's another thing for tribes to have the capacity and the ability to actually get these projects done. There are too many hurdles. And that's what we're focused on now, is eliminating those hurdles. And philanthropy has been picking up the slack of government, but it's going to take radical change within Washington for this to be a just transition.
Certainly in the western United States, a lot of tribal land sits on pretty big parcels but is thinly populated. And the energy infrastructure is terrible in those places. Now, if you look at the example of the telephone, in places where telephone infrastructure was terrible, it just sort of leapfrogged the home hardwired phone, and we just went past it. When finally, in a lot of places in the world, people could have telephones, they never had a wire that ran up to their house.
I saw that on a mountain in Costa Rica. They had cell phones.
Right. Well, is there a way to leapfrog and not lay hundreds of miles of copper to each individual homestead? And are there possibilities offered by more recent developments in transmission and distribution that mean that, okay, instead of trying to get a do-over for the 19th or 20th century, we go right to the front of the line for something new and better?
Absolutely. As I was saying earlier, lack of access to energy can be considered a form of energy poverty. There are, as we sit here today in 2023, 35,000 homes on the Navajo reservation that do not have access to energy. 800 on the tiny little Hopi reservation, for example. Those lines don't go there yet. Do we want to wait for that copper infrastructure to reach them? No. What we're looking at is developing microgrids and completely self-sustained islanded communities that can use clean energy instead of worrying about all that comes with even being connected to the grid in those communities. In many parts in the plains in the Southwest, being connected to the grid doesn't mean you have reliable electricity. If you're in a lot of these tribal communities, you get it. It's at the end of the line and you're the first to lose power and it doesn't come back on for days, right? And so because of colonization, we are dependent on electricity. So when your power goes out and you're not used to being without power, you don't have refrigeration, you don't have pumped potable water, you don't have air conditioning when it's 120 out. So yes, that's problematic. And that's why clean energy, especially solar, represents such an opportunity to solve those problems. But the costs of acquiring the money from the federal government to do those projects and the systematic barriers that still exist are the issue. And that's what we're working on solving.
I don't want to confine this conversation to the West. In the East, more built up, more densely populated. The parcels also of tribal land are smaller and, in some cases, more vulnerable. The times I've been on tribal land, ironically, I've been there to buy gasoline because it's cheaper. And on Mi'kmaq land in Nova Scotia, on Iroquois land in Quebec province, it's much cheaper than going to a regular provincially licensed petrol station. But the infrastructure is also, you can tell when you cross the border onto tribal land that the quality of the roads has changed, the way the light poles are set up has changed, all of that. Is it similar with the stuff that we can't see, underground transmission lines and gas and all that kind of thing? Is there a problem even in the much more densely populated, much more intensely gridded East?
You're exactly right. In the East, we have checkerboarded reservations where there's not large parcels of tribally owned contiguous land. Like I live on the Narragansett Reservation in so-called Rhode Island, and I live on a piece of fee land, and that reservation is little checkers. And so if there's a positive to that kind of tribal land, it's that you have the benefit of the better infrastructure for broadband, for energy, but you have the discriminatory prices and the prices period, and you don't have ownership or control over your energy. We're working with the Wabanaki Confederacy tribes, my people in Maine right now, and they're building microgrids anyway so that they can control their own energy and their costs. And when you can offer community solar or residential solar to your people, the avoided cost there, when you take that bill away from a family that is struggling, they're buying clothing and better food and medicines. And it's a tremendous impact on a family that's in poverty to have the energy bill go away. And so it is smart for any tribal community and any community in general to take advantage of what clean energy means.
Does your presence at APEC, in effect, ask them to think more broadly about what that phrase, one of the themes of the conference, just transition, means? Because, when people first hear about that and decarbonization, trying to stave off the worst effects of global climate change, they're thinking about island nations in the South Pacific. They're thinking about places on the Pacific Rim that might be asked to forego certain kinds of modern plant and facilities that are intense users of energy. But that's not what we're talking about. That's not what we've been talking about in this conversation.
No, a just transition, broadly speaking, means by the people, for the people. It means that Indigenous people have the opportunity to design what their energy system looks like going forward. They have an opportunity to get some help with it because of the oppression that they've suffered for so many centuries. A little help, please, is welcome to build an infrastructure on which our communities can start the next economy. And for it to be just, it should include our Native people building it. It shouldn't be outsiders coming in and usurping all of the value of these systems and sending it off res or out of the community. It should be the tribes themselves or partnerships that are in right relation, and it should be built by Native people for Native people. And that applies to any community. It should be built by the community. The jobs should be in the community. The operations and maintenance should remain with people in the community. If not, it's not just. And the money just goes out of the community and into the pockets of the settlers again.
Is there a kind of solidarity, a relationship with people, for instance, in the Torres Strait, Aboriginal people in Australia, people in the southern Philippines, and your struggles here in North America?
Absolutely. Colonization harmed the whole planet, all of us. No matter the color of our skin, no matter where our homelands are, it harmed all of us. And so Indigenous people especially, having been enslaved and massacred in exchange for their resources, there's ties that bind that span oceans for sure.
Does the APEC multi-stakeholder forum give you a vessel, a framework, a way to forge those connections? Can you talk to people about it while you're here?
It sure does. Just in this first day already, we've seen the benefits of bringing people together. We're all practitioners. We're all working on behalf of our communities, and we have a bond of understanding how hard it is, and yet we all won't give up. And so APEC and especially this forum that is small enough that you don't get lost in it, and Indigenous people, we prefer relationships over transactions. And this being as intimate as it is so appreciated, and giving us a platform to talk about things that most people don't even understand how are going on in the world. You know, you talk to most Americans, you think it's funny, but sometimes I get the question, really? Reservations still exist? Indians are still here? So to be on the world stage here, all of us, all of the Indigenous people that are here, to be on the world stage for even this few days, it has so much value towards building awareness. And there are entrepreneurial opportunities within tribal communities and with Indigenous people that have real value. It's not charity. There's opportunity for partnerships here, and being at this forum is a wonderful place to start those conversations.
Sherry Smith is the founder, the president and CEO of the Alliance for Tribal Clean Energy. She joined us in San Francisco. Thanks for being with us on Shifting Ground.
Thank you, Ray.
You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED with funding from listeners like you. Today's episode was produced by Elise Manukian and Andrew Stelzer. It was fact-checked by Adam Ailey. It was mixed and mastered by Matteo Schimpf. Additional production and engineering were provided by Rob Spate. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Sport is our executive producer. Philip Yun is CEO of World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.